This song is called The Green Belongs to Glasgow's Folk. Now the tune is McCarthy's Party, and it was written in the 1880s by Andrew Melville. The words written in 1987 were by Glasgow's Adam McNaughton. Come all ye folk o' Glasgow, help to stop this new fiasco. They're gonna change the green holus bolus with sluices, ponds and dams, and trains and boats and trams. Everything except the breeding gondolas. I'm willing to concede that some change is what we need. The only thing I can't thole is they scheme things at the top, then just tell us what's to happen without asking what the people want. Glasgow Green's a heart o' the city, it's a part o', but frae the map the council wants a app, so they've gied it to the planners, and this time they've went bananas, saying we'll flood it for a laugh. To them it doesn't matter if the green is underwater, that's a typical planner's joke. But we want consultation before any alteration, 'cause the green belongs to Glasgow's folk.
But when it's a gig, what you get is folk kind of lurch towards Rosie, like to grab her, and then you go, don't touch the dog, and then they go, well, you're nice, you go, oh no, she's anxious, and then folk go, oh no, I'm good with dogs, but they're really, really drunk, and she doesn't like that.
We're looking at the relationship between public space and festival and events, with a focus on how we might be able to produce more inclusive public space. So the main kind of focus of the project, the Festspace project, is to understand the relationship between festival events and public space, because festival events often are held in well-known public spaces, mainly parks, streetscapes, squares, for example. So there is an argument that these festivals and events can encourage people, different populations from different groups, for example, to come into public space, to interact in public space, to encounter different populations in public space, and that can be valuable in terms of increased social cohesion and contact with difference. So that's really the focus of our Festspace project, was to try and explore that across 5 European cities. So we have a focus on Glasgow, which is the Scottish city, Barcelona, Gothenburg, Dublin and London. So we're looking for sort of comparability in these different European contexts as to the relationship between festivals and events and public space. There are some issues that are to do with practicality and about operations. So there are issues associated with disruption. So if you live in and around an area where there's relatively large scale festivals or events taking place, then increasingly, because of the scale and size of these events now and the size of the industry, then often it creates disruption, because there is a period in which the event has to be built. I mean, literally has to be built in a park or maybe in our square or even in a streetscape. And then there's a period in which the event takes place, and there's a de-rig period, and that can extend for a number of weeks. And so there's a disruption in and around the period before and afterwards. So if you do want to access a particular space during that period, then it is going to be restricted. And we know that there are exceptions to the kind of some of the land reform legislation that allows that to happen, to close off particular areas for a particular period of times if you provide an alternative environment. But for people whose maybe everyday experience is of using a particular park and walking a particular route in a particular way, then that clearly kind of affects them. But there can be wider disruptions clearly associated with some of the outcomes associated with these events. So there can be noise pollution, which is problematic for certain types of events. There can be traffic disruption. living in your area, you can literally not be able to park for an extended period of time. There are also issues associated with littering, there's issues associated with antisocial behaviour that maybe accompany certain types or genres of events that, again, are problematic for people living in and around those areas in particular. So there's certainly that kind of feature of it. I think there's also kind of, there are broader issues associated with whether people feel that events should take place in parks, in squares, in some forms of our streetscapes, in the sense that, living in that area, you may have moved to the area because you had a park close by or whatever, and if that area is used then for events and festivals that are disruptive, that create some kind of disruption, then people can feel upset by that and feel that also they've perhaps not had a say in the decision making around about whether it should be used for that kind of space. So there's a local politics and sort of democracy dimension to this too, which is about how are we consulted, how are we involved in decision making and thinking about how our spaces should be used. So there's certainly a trend one way, which is that people feel they want to have more involvement, more participatory planning approaches and design approaches to our spaces, which may encourage people to have a say in that. And there's other pressures which are maybe for a local authority or promoters to actually ensure that they've got these events happening in those spaces, and then to secondly consult. There's the environmental potential damage that does come from the use of certain public spaces that perhaps were not designed for those purposes. So, many of our parks are not designed for the types of events that are happening in some of the parks that we see now. They certainly were used for events historically. So, Edinburgh, Princess Street Gardens, bandstands in Kelvin Grove Park, etc. Of course, these were used for festivity, for entertainment, for activities, but it was the nature of those events were different from what we see now, because large-scale events that have big infrastructures really do create different issues, and they clearly can create environmental degradation to areas, which means that the reparation period can be extended. But we've also seen that in Scotland in the context of Princess Street Gardens, in the context of to an extent, Glasgow Green, Bellahouston Park in Glasgow, certainly after a number of recent large-scale music festivals. And so there's clearly some significant issues there about who pays for the repair and whether actually, again, 6 weeks or longer of repair of the grass, of the ground conditions is acceptable. Those processes of common good land that were handed down to cities and that communities should have an understanding and awareness of what it was for and what it should be used for, that in principle is really, really important. But I think the point about people not really being aware of that, I think, is a very strong one. I mean, I think in towns and cities across Scotland there are common good funds, and I think it's important to say that those common good funds are often used for local galas and festivities that are hugely important to the communities that live there. And there's no problem with it often. In fact, that common good fund is absolutely crucial to the survival and success of those activities that many people within the communities that live there enjoy. So they're not by definition commercial. They support business in the local area, and that's a great thing. They provide employment, they provide volunteering opportunities, they provide an ability to come together collectively for social gathering that can be kind of vitally important for the sense of place and people's sense of identity. And I think people are particularly concerned now, become more aware of it, when it is for pure commercial imperatives. And maybe the resources that are generated by that festival or event go to a company that doesn't exist or live in or reside in the communities that we're talking about. So I think you're seeing what we might see as leakage, economic leakage, and if the common good funds or common good land are being used for that, then people say, well, that doesn't feel right.
Yeah, the current trend basically is linked to an evolution in public policies, which makes that there has been a crisis of traditional activities, especially industries, which have long driven the development of cities. And since basically the 70s, a lot of local governments in cities have tried to use culture as a way to rebrand, regenerate the city, which has involved them to bid for a lot of events and to attract a lot of events to the city. So it could generate money, so it could generate a lot of new image of the city on a national and global level. However, behind this, I think this whole discourse could also be nuanced a bit. So first, there is the idea that even in like cities where events have or like a huge element within the economy, it's not always the first economic sector. So, for example, in Edinburgh, which is a city that is known for its festival, events are important in terms of image, but they are not the first sector compared to a lot of like third sector activities like finance or local governments or other activities like that. Second, major events don't always generate a lot of money. So there is this issue, for example, there has been this issue in the past with the Olympics, for example, which are definitely an event bringing a lot of people to the city, but it requires to build a lot of infrastructures, especially stadium for the people attending. And so there is a controversy about the money that these events generate. However, they can be good drivers for economic development, and this is probably the way that they are used. These events were not that successful. They were sold on the basis of free tickets, and a lot of people got the tickets but didn't show up at the events, which makes that a lot of events were like half empty. So this has created a lot of conversation among residents about the fact that what is the point of having events that are not that are half empty, whereas probably the local community could access it during this time. And I think there is also another issue behind that, which is kind of the issue of involvement of residents, because most of the criticism are not so much linked to whether like events are happening or not, but the fact that residents don't have their say in that. And I think definitely on this level, the community of the engagement process is a way to make sure that events like residents are involved in that and can have a say in the future of their city.
For many years the Glasgow Green has suffered frae neglect. Now Templeton's is empty and the Dalton fountain's wrecked. They think as we've accepted this without an angry scene, we'll let them build a motorway across the Glasgow Green. The tourists go to Bannockburn or to Culloden Moor. We wick them through the city at 70 miles an hour. These places have just one event that makes them worth being seen. 1,000 years of history have marked the Glasgow Green.
I'm very passionate about the role of festivals and events as markers of identity, and place and space are aligned to that, and Glasgow's identity around the use of festivals and events has been in our history for forever really. And I think the way that Glasgow has used festivals and events as markers of identity and personal memory and things like that is really important. So for me, I'm more interested in some of the social value that goes along with events and what that means to communities. And, for Glasgow, George Square is both a site of protest but also a site of celebration, and festivals help to portray that really. For me, this is a real marker of Glasgow's passion and sense of worth, and its absolute belief in inclusion. And we're a city of immigrants, whether that's Irish or Italian or whatever. It's about welcoming, and we genuinely believe that anyone is welcome here. I think this use of space of Glasgow is really, really interesting, because we absolutely see this as our right to protest, peaceful protests, and send a message to the world about the things that are important to us and what we believe in. So something that's a global issue but really important in diversity. It's very much about what the people of Glasgow and the people of Scotland are about. So I thought that's a good example of how we can use festivity around a protest movement as well, but also then we can use it for other markers of identity, and whether that's Christmas light switch on or other parts of festivity as well within it. Scotland again and Glasgow have a lot of issues to deal with on the rights and protests of marches, and they're pretty political. So I think they've got some issues there that they have to deal with. And as long as they stay as peaceful, then I guess a lot of people have argued that there is a right to protest, and people in Festspace said they wanted George Square to still be part of that identity about the right to protest. People didn't see that as a problem. They saw the issue of the square as a protest as a good thing because we stood up for people's rights throughout history. I think the issue becomes when there's violence and when things are ruined, and that becomes more of an issue.
Britain enters lockdown. Now people can only leave their homes for very limited reasons.
Without a huge national effort to halt the growth of this virus, there will come a moment when no health service in the world could possibly cope.
So obviously the COVID-19 pandemic has had a major impact on the way we've been able to undertake field work for the project. So initially we were going to be doing lots of embodied work where we're going to be immersed in particular contexts, we're going to be observing in person, where we're going to be interacting with people, interviewing, surveying people. Clearly many and most festivals and events in the traditional form of an in-person event were cancelled from the period of March 2020 onwards. So obviously that had a big impact on the way that we think about public space, outdoor public space, and how people were interacting in it. We saw, of course, that outdoor public space had a different value. Often it was a place for recreation, a place for people to get out and have their regular walks or encounters, because that was what was possible during the pandemic.
One of the things I think that festivals and events that we forget about that they can do in terms of looking at the social value of these is, and what happened during COVID was it rekindled some of that community spirit. And we talk about loneliness and well-being, but we often don't really measure that, or we don't know how to evaluate that in some cases. But in looking at the role of events and festivals during COVID, we've really seen that in the heart of communities, and we've seen how to do that you can see the social value of these, that we've tackled loneliness, we've dealt with things like inclusion, because communities themselves have done it. People have met their neighbours for first time in a long time, the neighbours along the street that you might not know beyond 2 doors down, whether that's been a Friday night jamming session out in the street or bingo played in local communities, walks in the park that have been created that people didn't know about. We've heard loads of stories about this, and that's not unique to Glasgow. That is, that's throughout the country, and certainly in sort of suburban communities that you know, people have gone to work and come home, but actually they're not doing that anymore because they're at home, so they're exploring their community more. And I think some of these things have been really valuable for people's mental health and well-being, and we've understood the role that festivals can play. And things like gala days or small community festivals that might have had quite a strong identity in the past, but they've maybe fallen by the wayside, lack of funding or whatever, and local communities have restarted some of those, and I think we'll see some of those things continue. We've had to think creatively and differently, so everything from windows in the West and Battlefield during Halloween, and that's continued, you know, sort of Christmas lights, streets from the 1st to the 24th, people lighting up their whole streets and creating walks for people to do that, engaging people in different ways through, you know, it's just thinking a bit differently. How can we engage people in the community, and how do festivals and events play a part of that? That's not to say that the role of Christmas light switch on or big festivities in city centres or George Square don't have a place anymore. They do, but they have more than just a celebration which perhaps excluded a lot of people because it was, you know, these things are often ticketed and there's only a certain amount of tickets. So we've looked to communities to do things a bit differently and to create their own celebrations more locally. And that's what happened years ago. So we're back to that, you know, sense of well-being and belonging in community that events and festivals can offer, I think.
I can confirm now in summary that we have decided to introduce from midnight tonight for the duration of January a legal requirement to stay at home except for essential purposes. This is similar to the lockdown of March last year.
But it did actually open up some possibilities where we had to pivot the research to look at, I guess, a concept of digital public space where people were still having festival and events but having them in a mediated form, online, digitally. So we were able to look at some of those events that actually moved from being in person to online and how that might have altered the way that those events were being conceived and the objectives of the event, perhaps even broadening the kind of people who were engaging with the event, because there are restrictions to in-person events in terms of who actually goes. There can be issues about people's capital to actually attend in-person events. So Book Festival is a good example of that, where you can understand something quite different about an online event because it works online, but you can also change the dynamic of the audience. So we were able to explore these things, which I think are going to be becoming increasingly common.
I'd say it depends who is the we. I think if there is first we, which is probably the attendees, and I think probably over the pandemic we have all realized how important are attending events in terms of well-being, in terms of involvement in local communities, but also we have experienced public spaces that have been slightly less crowded than before. And this has been probably a negative experience to some, but it has also been a positive experience for a lot of people, and I'm thinking especially about local residents who are used to have festivals all summer long in their park. So I think it has probably changed a bit the way we perceive it, but I think there are also other we here, which are probably first the local authority. And I think this has really raised the question of the necessity of events, of the promotion of events by local authority. And in Edinburgh, for example, it has furthered the debate about the role of events in public spaces, because it has really created a major disruption in the events in a city where events were mainly aimed at national or international tourists. And so I think this has created a whole debate of to what extent it was a good idea, not of hosting events, but hosting events that are mainly aimed at people who are as volatile as international tourists, and especially about the fact that this crisis could happen again, especially in a context where we have climate change, and this might create a lot of disruption on the long term in terms of the flux of international tourism coming over to Scotland. But I think on the other hand, the pandemic has also reinforced the need to have public policies that can be adapted to major crises. And there were a lot of things in urbanism which were already trendy before the crisis, like the idea of pop-up urbanism, of the temporary installations in public spaces. And I think definitely the pandemic has reinforced that, for example, with the idea of like putting some big terrace next to the bars within public spaces, closing off public spaces to cars to make it more walkable for people, creating some spaces for local people which can be animated in different ways. And definitely, I think the whole thinking about the role of events in public space is going probably to play a major role in the future because of that. And I think probably a third we on this level is also the point of view of the festival organizers. Because basically the pandemic has been really challenging on this level because there is an issue of how can you organize festivals and events which are about gathering people in public spaces within the time of social distancing. So this has led to a whole reflection on the type of events that could be used for this specific time. And for example, the fact that light and sound shows work very well compared to music festivals, which have been struggling a bit more. And also the whole rise of more hybrid type of events. And so I think this has created a whole reflection about that. Good example of that, again, is probably the case of the Govan Hill Festival, which has been taking place since 2016 in Govan Hill, the south of Govan Hill, and which takes place in a neighborhood which has been really which has had a negative perception over the past years due to crime, poverty, and etc. But there is the Govan Hill Festival is definitely targeted, definitely promoted as an anti-racist festival that aims to change the perception on the area. And one of the main elements within this festival is a parade, a carnival that is taking place in the streets during one day of the festival. And there is definitely this idea through the carnival of showing the various communities living in Govan Hill, the various local organizations and what they are doing, and all this vibrant area that is completely different from what is said of Govan Hill in the media, for example. And so there is kind of the idea of reversing the stigma of the neighborhood. And this can be, Govan Hill is a perfect example for that, but we can probably extend that to a lot of other events happening in public spaces. So a lot of things has been said over the past decades about the gay prides, for example, which are also kind of reversing the perceptions of public spaces, making it more inclusive for various type of population who are not the norm that we see on a daily basis in public spaces, and who are often being excluded because of that. And so I think definitely festivals can help with that. But I think what is interesting in the Festspace project is that there are also a lot of different social benefits. So the first one is probably the fact that festivals can contribute to make urban spaces more inclusive. So for example, by contributing to foster the representations of marginalized community. So this is the case, for example, with the Govan Hill Festival, which is in the south side of Glasgow, which is a neighborhood which has long been marked by an image of poverty, crime, inter-ethnic conflicts. And actually the festival helps to show that the neighborhood that is proud of its diversity, of the various contributions that a lot of migrants make to the neighborhood, make to the local community. So this is probably the first social impact. I'd say the second one is the fact that festivals can also contribute to reinforce the exchanges between various communities. So a good example of that in Glasgow is the case of Mela, which was originally a celebration of the South Asian diaspora, but it has transformed year after year, and it shows that you have, it shows festival that aims to create some links between various communities in Glasgow and helps to the mutual understanding of issues that are linked to, or issues and the contribution that are linked to the South Asian diaspora. And probably a last potential benefits that can have festivals on a social level is the fact that it can reinforce the involvement of local citizens within the event and festival design, but also more generally within the life of urban public spaces. And so, as an example, a lot of events on this level in Glasgow have a community engagement process. And what is interesting is that this community engagement process can be can gather people who are for or against festivals, but in both cases they kind of create some very interesting discussion about what public spaces in cities should be for, and what should be the future of that, and what is the role that events should occupy within this. And so this is they are in a way like platform which can allow to listen to what citizens have to say about the future of urban public spaces.
Looking to the future, I think it's clear that festival and events remain meaningful to people, mainly because they provide a break from everyday routine and also enable people to come together, whether that's in person or increasingly, as we've seen, online, to mark that kind of shared passion or interest that people have. I think it's unlikely that large-scale festival and events will return in quite the same form as we experienced before, or even using the same public spaces. During the pandemic, new spaces were created or used to host gatherings in car parks and airports and out-of-town environments. Features around about climate emergency and an increased awareness of the value of green space, for example, will, I expect, lead to more consideration over the suitability of parks and other spaces to host large-scale events. And we hope a greater need for cities to plan more effectively their distribution of festivals and events programmes across different forms of public spaces to avoid some of the disruptions that have been created in their hosting. However, we also expect to see neighbourhood and community events flourish, revitalised, I think, by that increased focus on the local during the pandemic. These sorts of events can bring life to a place, animate its streets and outdoor public spaces, and also facilitate more regular encounters and interactions between residents or visitors to that area. And in that context, I think festival and events are pleasurable experiences that can certainly enhance the well-being of both people, but also of places.